and welcome to a lecture on Gilded Age cities and society, and what did this rapid urbanization that was happening during this time, what did it mean for churches, for schooling, for education, and for attitudes towards sex. And so we're going to start off with churches and churches in the Gilded Age, and for the most part having to confront this new challenge of the cities and these rapidly growing cities. And we'll start with looking at the traditional churches. And for them, these traditional churches reflected the attitudes of the wealth of their prosperous members, people like John D. Rockefeller. And so they don't really see themselves as having a role of caring for the poor. Instead, they are to guide people sort of morally. And they're slow to confront new social and economic problems, and some of them rejected the new understandings in science, particularly biology and chemistry, that was occurring during this period. So these are churches like the Episcopalian Church, which is the oldest church that's from the old Anglican Church, the Church of England. It was the Episcopalian Church. They changed their name. And really like the established churches during this time. For a new generation of churches, what we would call liberal Protestant churches, they were able to sort of look at this new science, this new understanding of things like Charles Darwin's evolution, and reconcile that with teachings of Christianity. You can have both. It's not an either-or situation of having one or the other. And so, they were able to reconcile with the new science and the new ideas about economics. And for them, it's about ethics, it's about this community, and it's about personal growth, the liberal Protestants. So by liberal, we mean open to new ideas, not conservative, and being able to adapt to change. And these churches are going to take on a much broader role within the communities that we'll get to in a moment. And Jews and Catholics, the immigrant churches, fastest growing because of the immigration. And by 1900, Catholic Christians is the largest group of all Christians. And, the Italians were Catholic, the Irish were Catholic, many of the Germans were Catholic, Central Europeans, such as coming from the Austria-Hungary Empire, and those in lesser numbers, but from Spain and France and Mexico. And so it is a lot of Catholics coming in during this time. And it's maybe a little ironic because the United States had started out and their early identity as being very anti-Catholic. And, to ask before this immigration happened, what's a real American? Who's a real American? The answer would invariably come back that it's the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Well, now that's being challenged down of who is an American. And it's a little bit harder to define who is an American because of the diversity that's now coming in. And new Protestant churches, for example, the Moody Church, and that's this is showing one here, and they could attract very large groups and are particularly popular amongst the working class community. And you can see the people here, they're not necessarily all that well off. And these liberal churches, they're filling a vacuum, offering comfort to people who have been displaced, providing a refuge for the poor. They can be a community for the lonely. Cities, if you're new to the city, it can be a terribly lonely place. In the country, the role of the church had been to offer explanations for the way of the world, but this traditional role as explanation is being shattered by the scientific ideas pouring out during this time, the ideas of chemistry and biology. And so these churches are finding a new role, that role of providing a voice. And so for those that clung to traditional explanations, would become ridiculed amongst the educated and especially in the cities. But those old traditional explanations of, why we were created do remain strong in the countryside. Besides the Moody Church, this is showing the Salvation Army, the YMCA, the Young Men Christians Academy, where you can get a lot of sort of recreational things. Those are also prospering in these cities. Now, what about the church and Darwin? And traditional conservative fundamentalist churches refuse to accept this new science. It's just wrong, they would argue. It's in the Bible that you've got explanation. And then you've got the opposite, a new accommodationists who are willing to accept the Bible as neither history nor science, but something else. And so for the old, the Bible offers hard evidence of God's creation of earth and man and a guideline of how to live. Whereas with the new, the Bible offers metaphors and the examples of Jesus, but it's not an explanation. It's a much more looser interpretation. And it's within this that we start to see a wedge coming in. And we start to see the beginning of a fundamental cultural division in the United States between conservatives of traditional values and liberals that remain, and liberals, embracing new ideas. And this wedge, this split, is very prominent still today in American society. Okay, so that's it for religion. Moving on to education, and this was a time there's a really strong desire for learning. It's as this titled, "The Lust for Learning." There's a very strong desire for to learn, and in public education, the idea, that democracy equals education. Now, we've seen this before. This is a continuity, and from the likes of Horace Mann during the market revolution, and the argument that in a modern society there's a need for a modern education. Now, Mann was in the time of the market revolution, and public schooling rarely went past 8th grade. Now the focus is much more on the high school, and there's rapid growth of high schools during this time and of people attending high schools. And education is also seen as a way to assimilate immigrants into the American culture. You bring the kids into the school, they're going to learn the language, they're going to learn the civics and the history, and they'll mingle among, traditional Americans and pick up the American culture. New ideas about education, teacher training and the concept teaching profession grew. Now again, that's not necessarily new, but it becomes much more entrenched and much more national in it. Kindergartens taken from the Germans, and adults wanting an education, particularly the immigrants. They had a really strong desire to learn the language, for a lot of them to learn to read. Remember, many of them are of peasant stock coming in. Now the effects of this is the literacy rate really falls, and for most Americans are able to read. You'll see you get a better educated people within the cities than in the countryside, and definitely a better education in the northern states especially than in the south and in the west. And this education in the high school as well is preparing people for the modern world of business and finance and engineering, science and mathematics, these kinds of things. And we can see here, if you look on the one on the right, showing the percentage of high school graduates. In 1870, just 2% would graduated high school. But then it starts to go up slowly and then really takes off after 1920s. Now, universities during this time also rapidly expanding, and for women as well, and women colleges really taking off, or co-ed universities where both men and women would together learn, and particularly in the Midwest. Down in the South, we have Reconstruction era black universities beginning at this time, and the two most prominent ones are Tuskegee and Howard University, both of them receiving large donations from John D. Rockefeller, who was interested in helping African Americans achieve an education. They're mostly focused on vocational training, so it's not going into learning law, it's to improve agriculture in particular, or to learn a trade in mechanics or whatnot, to become a skilled laborer. And an important national government law that was passed during the Civil War, and it's a donation of federal land to states. Here's some land that you can have if you were to build a state university on it, and these are what we call land grant colleges, and a lot of the state universities, which are publicly funded universities, got their start in this way. As we mentioned before, Rockefeller is willing to give, and there was a lot of universities that were begun from the donations of some of these large rich capitalists. Cornell University, named for Cornell. Stanford University as well. Duke University, big tobacco guy is Duke. And the University of Chicago got its start from Rockefeller. And these schools more and more are focused on research and specialty, not sort of a classical education that you would before. And again, it's preparing for the modern world of business, finance, engineering, science, mathematics, these kind of things. And specialty schools, a school that might specialize in agriculture or in engineering or business or chemistry, for example. There's Stanford University being built. And just sort of continuing with this, this new science and the new world of business, it demands a different kind of education that you would traditionally get at a university. So previously, you would get a classical curriculum that would focus on religion, on classical literature, and rhetoric, and the natural sciences. But now it's much more about sort of these pragmatic skills that we need in business, in the world of finance, in the world of commerce, or engineering and science. And there's a much more focus on these sort of things. All right, moving on to the cities and reading. The more people can read, and reading and the publishing industry, this is really a golden age. Libraries, the poor man's university. Carnegie funded over 1,700 public libraries just in the United States alone. And Library of Congress was set up. It's the world's largest library. And it's also a golden age of newspapers, particularly because of the invention of something called the linotype, which just made printing them much cheaper. And these newspapers, a lot of them were what we would call yellow journalism, which is just trying to get as many readers as possible. And so sensational, tabloid, scandal, and sex, and these appealed especially to the immigrant masses who are often newly literate. They've just learned how to read. And for more highbrow, sort of not that sensational, some of these magazines like Harper's, Atlantic Monthly, and The Nation, all of these magazines, particularly The Atlantic and The Nation, are still around today and still doing the job that they're doing back then. They're smaller in circulation, but for them it's not about making money, it's about the ideas that they represent. And often they would have backers, people who are funding them, at a loss just to get those ideas out, particularly political ideas. And their sort of thinking is, okay, if 1,000 people read it, then possibly like 10,000 will then know the idea, because one person will read it and, hey, I heard about this idea. In these ones, the Atlantic Monthly, in there we got a penny newspaper, very, very cheap. All right, finally on to sex in the Gilded Age. And if we look at what the traditional values, Victorian era values, and in this one, sex was seen as a functional thing that's only really to be done within marriage, and it has the function of creating children. And women were seen as not possessing any kind of a sexual appetite, and so she shouldn't be having sex except for that functional reason. And her energies are entirely consumed by child rearing and menstruation, and she simply could not expend energies in other fields, which is one of the arguments of why they should not get into the world of business or politics and confine themselves to the world of the home only. They don't have the energy for it would be argued. Divorced women were heavily, heavily stigmatized as there's something wrong with her. And husbands who cheated were viewed as helpless. They're victims to their own urges, whereas women who cheat are seen as kind of amoral. And there's really only two kinds of women. The woman who has no sexual appetite, or a sick woman who has a perverse sexual appetite. Now, these traditional values very much get challenged in the world of the cities. And the challenges to them, particularly one woman, her name is Victoria Woodhull, and the idea of free love. She's a little bit ahead of her time and a very strong feminist. And what we mean by free love, and this is her own words, this is what she said of free love. She said, "Yes, I am a free lover. I have an inalienable, constitutional, and natural right to love whom I may, to love as long or as short a period as I can, to change that love every day if I please, and with that right neither you nor any law can frame have any right to interfere." It's basically just saying, look, I have the right to have sex, and stop judging me, is what she would be saying. And this is a very bold sort of idea at the time, and she was quite vilified by a lot of people. But a lot of people are sort of, hey, yeah, speak up. And within these cities, unmarried women have a lot more independence than they would ever have had out on the farm, where there's the eyes around her. She's got this independence. She's working, get off work, and go down to the dance halls, go down to a club, and hang out. And you've got that freedom to just be yourself. And there's just a lot more discussion among people on sex and on birth control as well, which without birth control, sex outside of marriage can be a very dangerous thing for a woman. And so birth control was illegal, by the way, at this time as well. Now, there's limitations to challenging traditional values as well. And one are what were known as the Comstock laws, which were laws that prohibited by the U.S. Mail Department anything that is seen as obscene and lewd. Now, can you define obscene? What's obscene to you might be perfectly fine to somebody else. And so that's a very difficult thing to define. Now, we'll see, that is going to come into play. Conservative values very much remain strong about what is right for a man and for a woman, and the double standard is also going to remain very strong. I still see it today. The double standard is different standards for men and for women about what is considered normal sexual behavior. Now, where do we see this rift playing out? Well, here's Victoria Woodhull. There she is. And there's Anthony Comstock, for whom the Comstock laws are labeled. They hated each other, absolutely hated each other. Comstock was absolutely dedicated to Victorian values and had strict sense of morality and what is right and wrong. And he had set up, as part of a New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, basically to tell people what you can and can't do. And it was on this that he was able to get these Comstock laws passed, and he was actually a special agent in charge of sort of seeing that this law is enforced. And what's obscene to him? Any sort of writing on birth controls, any kind of advice on how to not get a sexually transmitted disease. Anatomy textbooks were not mailed because of these Comstock laws. And Victoria Woodhull absolutely despised these, and she had a newspaper of her own, and she published in her newspaper, she published advertisement for contraceptives, for birth control within her newspaper. She was the first woman to run for president of the United States. She ran 5 times, and in the election of 1872, she was arrested for obscenity and for printing obscenity in her newspaper, as she wrote about a sexual affair between Harriet Beecher, a very prominent Christian, and which was true. She wasn't telling any sort of lies, and Comstock had her arrested. The charges did not stick. She was never found guilty for obscenity. And I think these two very much represent this schism that's starting to develop and will be continue from this point on between liberals, those willing to accept change, and conservatives who are sticking to traditional values. All right, thank you very much for